Hey folks, in this episode we're going to be making a geometry node's noise texture loop. This is just one use case which it can be used for, so without further ado, let's get to it. Open up Blender. I'm in layout view up here. I'm going to take my cursor to the bottom left until I see a crosshair. I'm going to left click, drag and open up a new window. I'm going to change this from the 3D viewport to the timeline. I'm going to change my end frame on my timeline to 120 frames. Over my timeline I just click home, and that will ensure the start and end of my timeline is captured in the view there. I'll then navigate to Edit, Preferences, and under Add-ons, search for Node, and then enable the Node Wrangler here. Once you've enabled that, click this button, click Save Preferences, and that will ensure the Node Wrangler loads every time you load Blender. I'll just close this window here. I'm going to take my cursor over to the right here and click this Output tab, and ensure that your frame rate is set to 30 frames per second. I'm also going to click Render Region, and that will ensure that only the camera is rendered in my viewport. I'll then select my default cube. I'm going to navigate over to my Modifier tab over here. I'm going to add a subdivision surface, so I'm going to click Add Modifier. I'm going to go to Generate, and we'll choose Subdivision Surface. There is a shortcut for that, so if I just close this subdivision surface, you can hit Ctrl 2, and that will add a subdivision surface at level 2, or Ctrl 3, and that will add one at level 3. I'll set my subdivision surface to level 2. I'll then click Add Modifier. I'm going to go to Deform and I'll choose Cast. I'll hit numpad 1 to go into front view. And what the Cast modifier does, it ensures that the cube will conform to an exact sphere. So if I just disable the Cast modifier, you can see it's slightly deforming. So with the Cast modifier on, it's an exact sphere. Excellent. I'll then navigate to the top of my modifier stack. I'll click Apply All, and that will apply all the modifiers. Excellent. I'm just going to reduce my timeline down here. I'm going to take my cursor to the bottom left of the 3D viewport until I see the crosshair. I'll left click and I'm going to drag up, and that will open up a new window. I'll then navigate to the top left of that 3D viewport and I'll change it from 3D viewport to Geometry Node Editor. And in your Geometry Node Editor, I'm going to click New, and I'm going to rename this to Wobble Noise Looper GN for geometry nodes. I'll then click that name. I'm going to hit Ctrl C to copy. I'll then navigate to my outliner up here. I'm going to double click the cube object and I'll hit Ctrl V and I'll paste that name into there. And now in my geometry node editor, I'm going to hit N to hide the N panel. I'm going to zoom in. In fact, I'm going to increase this window to give us more room. I'll just drag this over here. I'll drag this over to here. The way we're going to deform this sphere will be using a noise texture. So in my geometry nodes window, I'm going to hit Shift A and I'm going to search for noise, and we'll choose noise texture. I'll just pop that there. To deform this sphere, or the individual vertices on the sphere, we're going to have to use a set position node. So I'm going to hit Shift A and we'll search for set, and we'll choose set position, and I'll pop that in between there. I'll change the noise texture from 3D to 4D. I'll then plug the color from the noise texture into the offset of the set position node, and what this has done, it's offsetted the vectors by 0.5, so we need to subtract 0.5 from this to recenter the sphere. That's easy enough. I'm going to hit Shift A and I'm going to search for vector, and we'll choose vector math, and I'll pop that in between there. I'll then change it from add to subtract, and then for the X, Y and Z we subtract it by 0.5, and it should be perfectly center. Excellent. I'll just hit numpad 1 to go into front view. To adjust the strength of the deformation, I'm going to take this vector math node, I'm going to hit Shift D to duplicate, and I'll pop it in between there, and I'm going to change it from subtract to multiply. For ease of use, I want to expose these values on my modifier over here, so I'm going to drag this vector and I'm going to plug it into the bottom socket of the group input node. I'm going to select the group input node, I'm going to hit N to open up the N panel, and where it says group here, I'm just going to expand these options. I'm going to select the vector socket. We're going to change it from vector to float, and that will give us one value. I'll just scroll down and I'm going to click single value, and that gets rid of that extra button there. I'll set a default value of 0.5, and now on my modifier I'm going to set the value to 0.5, so we can now change this on the fly. Excellent. So in your group sockets, I'm going to double click the vector name and I'm going to rename it to noise strength. I also want to expose the scale value here from the noise texture, so I'm going to drag this scale value into the bottom socket of the group input. I'll go over to my N panel, I'm going to double click the scale name and I'll rename this to noise scale. I'm going to set a default value of 2.5, and again I'll enable single value. I'll navigate to my geometry nodes modifier, and for the noise scale I'm going to type in 2.5. So now we need to animate this W factor here. So I'll hit Shift A and I'm going to search for scene and we'll choose scene time, and I plug the frame into the W factor. If I push play, you can see it's going pretty crazy. Obviously we need to slow this animation down. I hit Shift A, I'm going to search for math, and we'll add a math node, and I'll pop that in between the scene time and the noise texture. I'm going to change it from add to divide, and we'll divide it by, let's say, 100. If I hit play, you can see that the animation has slowed down. It doesn't loop yet. We'll fix that now. So I'll just zoom out. I'm going to box select these nodes. I'm going to hit G, bring them across to around about there. I'll select this group input. I'm going to hit G. I'll just bring this up to here. I'll then box select the scene time and the divide node. I'm going to hit G, bring these over to here. I'm going to take this divide node and hit Shift D to duplicate, and I'll pop it over to here. I'm going to change it from divide to multiply. I'm going to plug the divide node into the bottom socket. I'll just drag this down over to here. I'm going to take the frame from the scene time and plug it into the top socket of the multiply node. Duplicate the multiply node by hitting Shift D, and I'll pop it in between there. We'll change this from multiply to floored modulo, and floored modulo truncates the texture, so it takes a slice of texture and repeats it. So if I was to set this to, let's say, 30, that means that the W factor will be sliced at 30 frames, so it should repeat every 30 frames. So if I just change this value to, let's say, 3000, and essentially what the floored modulo does, it creates a repeating pattern. To complete the seamless loop process, we're going to need to duplicate the noise texture, invert it, and then we're going to need to divide it with the original floored modulo. So I'll select this noise texture, shift select this multiply node, I'm going to hit Shift D to duplicate, and I'm going to pop that down there. I'll then hit Shift A, and I'm going to search for mix color, and I'll pop that in between these two nodes here. I'll then connect the color from this noise texture into socket B. I'll select this math node here. I'm going to hit Shift D. I'm going to pop that in there. I'm going to change it from multiply to subtract. Let me just box select these nodes here. I'm going to hit G, just give us a bit of breathing space. With the floored modulo, I'm going to hold down Shift, right click and drag through this noodle to create a control point. I'll then take this and pop it into the top socket of the subtract node. I'll then plug the subtract node into the multiply node. And with this divide node, I'm going to hold down Shift, right click and drag across the noodle to create another control point. Drag this into the bottom socket of this multiply node. I'll then take this math node. I'm going to hit Shift D and I'll pop it down here, and I'll change this from multiply to divide. I'll then connect this noodle from the floored modulo into the top socket of the divide node. In fact, I'm going to box select this control point here. I'm going to hit Control X just to dissolve that. I'm going to do the same for this one. So I'm going to box select this control point. I'm going to hit Control X, and that will dissolve that point. I'll then take the value from this divide node and plug it into the factor of this mix color node. I'll then hit Shift A, and I'm going to search for group, and we'll choose group input. I'm going to plug the bottom value from the floored modulo into the bottom socket here. I'll then plug the bottom value from this subtract node into the same socket, and I'll take the bottom value socket from this divide node and plug that into the same socket on the group input. So now they're all plugged into this one input called value. I'll navigate over to my M panel. I'm going to double click the value name, and I'm going to rename this to loop frame. I'm going to set a default value of 120 because I've got 120 frames on my timeline, and on the geometry nodes modifier I'm going to set the loop frame to 120. I'll also go back to my M panel and I'll enable single value. On your scene time over here, I'm going to hit G, just bring this across. So between the scene time from the frame socket and this divide node, I'm going to hold down Control, right click and drag and disconnect that noodle. Now this becomes our speed factor. For this to work, we're going to have to plug the scale into the scale socket of the group input. So I'm just going to drag this scale factor into the noise scale of the group input. Now if I hit play, this should loop seamlessly. Excellent. I know this looks messy at the moment. We'll clean this up in a minute. But for now, I'm just going to bring this group input up to here, and I'm going to connect this top value from this divide node into an empty socket on the group input. I'll then navigate to my end panel over here. I'm going to scroll down to where it says value. I'm going to double click that, and I'm going to rename it to speed. I'll also enable single value. Let's do a bit of house tidying before we continue. So I'm going to take this group input node. I'm going to go to node. I'm going to enable color. I'll expand these options here, and I'm going to give it a color, maybe something around there perhaps. I'll then hit Shift D to duplicate, and this one is connected to loop frames, so I'm going to connect this loop frame into this socket here. I'll then hit Control H, and that will hide all the sockets except the one that's being used. The next loop frame will be this one here, So I'm going to take this group input, I'm going to hit Shift D, I'm going to duplicate that over here. I'll then plug this loop frame into this socket, and I'll do the same for this one down here. So I'll take this group input, I'm going to hit Shift D, I'll bring this across over to here and plug the loop frame into there. That cleans up some of the noodles. I'll just drag this up to here, I'm going to hit Control H to hide all the sockets except the one in use. So I'll take this group input here, I'm going to hit Shift D, I'm just going to drag this up to, let's say, round about here. And this was the noise scale. So if this group input selected, I'm going to hit Control H to unhide all the sockets. I'll take this noise scale socket and plug it into the scale of this noise texture. I'm going to hit Control H and that will hide all the unused sockets. I'll then hit Shift D to duplicate. I'll pop it down there. I'll then plug the noise scale socket into the scale socket of the noise texture. I'll select this group input. I'm going to hit Shift D to duplicate and I'll pop that down here. And that one was the noise strength. So with this group input selected, I'll hit Control H to unhide all the sockets. I'll then connect the noise strength socket into the bottom socket of this vector math node. Hit Control H to hide all the empty sockets. Shift D to duplicate, Control H to unhide, connect the geometry socket, Control H to rehide all the unused sockets. I'll just take this group input, I'll hit delete. Okay, that's looking a bit less decluttered. We'll clean this up a bit more in a minute. We'll just add a couple more features. So I'll take this math node, I'm going to hit Shift D to duplicate and I'll pop it in between there. I'll then hit Shift D to duplicate and I'll pop it in between there. I'm going to change this from multiply to add. I'll change this one from multiply to add. I'll then take this group input, Shift D to duplicate, Control H to unhide all the sockets. I'll then take this bottom value from this multiply node and plug it into this empty slot on this group input. And I'll take this bottom value from this math node and plug it into the same value socket. I'll select the group input node. I'll navigate over to my end panel, over to the right. I'm going to click the group tab. I'm going to scroll down until I can see that value. I'm going to double click that and I'm going to rename it to seed. I'm going to change it from float to integer. Scroll down and I'll enable single value. So now on our geometry nodes modifier, you can see that we can change the seed value. Excellent. And with this group input selected, I'm going to hit Control H to hide all the empty sockets. I'll add one more feature and that will be a vertex selection socket. And we can do that with this selection socket over here. So I'm going to take this group input node, I'm going to hit Shift D to duplicate. I'm going to hit Control H to unhide all the sockets. And I'll connect this selection socket from the set position node and plug it into the empty socket on the group input node. I'm going to go to my end panel over here. I'm going to scroll down until I see selection. I'm going to double click selection and I'll rename this to vertex group. I'll then select that group input, Control H to hide all the empty sockets and I'll pop that down here. I'm just going to hit N to hide the end panel. I'll just drag this across over to here. Let me just increase this window. I'm now going to do a bit of housekeeping and tidy up this node structure. All I'll be doing is holding down Shift, right clicking and dragging through noodles to create these control points, and then I'll hit G to move them. I'll also hit G to move some of these nodes, and the same over here, right click, drag and G. I'm going to do that now. I'll speed the video up and show you the end result. Okay, so that's the final node structure. You can take a screenshot if you like. I decided to only have one group input for the loop frame, which was this value here, and then this value over here, just to keep the node structure a bit cleaner. We just need to add a couple more nodes here. So I'm going to zoom in all the way to the end here. I'm going to hit Shift A and I'm going to type in set and we'll choose set material. I'll pop that in there and I'll choose the default material I've got set in Blender. I'll just check I got that material applied to this object. So I'll navigate over to my shader tab over here and I've got that material selected. Maybe I'll rename this material to wobble noise loop, and it should have changed in your set material as well. If not, reselect it here. Now I want to capture the data from these two noise textures, so I can import it into the shader editor to use as a mask. That's easy enough. I'll hit Shift A and I'm going to search for store, and we'll choose store named attribute, and I'll pop that in between the set position and the set material node. I'll just zoom into that node. I'm going to give this attribute a name. I'm going to call it mask. To use this mask in the shader editor, we're going to have to remember this name, exactly how it's spelt, and it's case sensitive. We can just hover our cursor over this name and hit Control C and then paste it into the attribute node using Control V in the shader editor. I'm going to change it from float to color. And the attribute we're going to capture will be the result from this mixed color node here. I'll neaten this up, so I'll hold down Shift, right click and drag just to add a control point there. I'm going to hit G, bring this down to around about there. I'm going to hold down Shift, right click and drag, add another control point. I'll hit G, just bring this across over to here. I'll then Shift select this control point. So we've got both control points selected. I'm going to hit SY0 to scale it on the y-axis by 0, and that should straighten that out. Excellent. Before we move on to the materials, it's a good idea to go to File, Save As, and I'm going to save my project as Like and Subscribe. Thanks folks, you absolute legends. I'll just click Save As. I'll take my cursor to the top left of the Geometry Nodes window. I'm going to click this button and change it from Geometry Node Editor to Shader Editor. Excellent. I'm just going to give this a simple material just to show you the fundamentals of how it works. You can extrapolate and improve your material. The magic happens with the attribute node, so I'm going to hit Shift A and search for attribute, and we'll choose input attribute. And the name for that attribute was mask with a capital M. I'll then drag the factor into the base color of the principal BSDF. Let's just go into viewport shading. I'll then hit Shift A and I'm going to go converter, and we'll choose color ramp. And I'll pop that in between there. I'll click the plus button once just to add one flag in the middle. And for this flag, I'm going to set the position to 0.45. And for this last flag, I'm going to set the position to 0.55. I'll set this first flag to blue, something around there. I'll then take my cursor over that color. I'm going to hit Control C to copy. I'll then select this end flag here and hit Control V to paste, and then I'll select the middle flag and I'm going to change this to like a yellow colour, maybe something around there. Blue and yellow are complementary colours on the colour wheel, so try and choose a complementary colour palette with your choice. In my 3D viewport, I'm going to right click and choose Shade Smooth. I then go over to my Modifier tab over here. I'll then go to Add Modifier. I'm going to go to Generate and I'm going to choose Edge Split. I'll then drag that above the Geometry Nodes modifier. I'm going to reduce the edge angle to 0. I'll then click Add Modifier. I'm going to go to Generate and I'll choose Subdivision Surface. I'm just going to increase my 3D viewport window. And on the subdivision surface, I'm going to increase this to maybe level 2. That will do for now. I'll then go to my modifier panel. I'm going to click Add Modifier, Generate, and we'll choose Solidify. I'll scroll down to the Solidify modifier. I'm going to change the offset to +1. I'm going to increase the thickness to, let's say, 0.1. I'm going to choose Even Thickness. I'll scroll up to the top of the modifier stack. I'm going to click Add Modifier. I'll go to Generate and I'm going to choose Subdivision Surface. Maybe we can set this to level 2. For this middle subdivision surface, I'm going to set it to level 1 for viewport and render. Maybe I can increase the Solidify modifier to, let's say, 0.2. I'll just scroll to the top of the modifier stack so I can see my Wobble Noise Looper modifier. I'm going to hit play just to see what we've got. I'm going to increase the noise strength to 1. Okay, that's looking kind of good. I'm going to decrease my noise scale to 2 and I'm going to set my speed to 1. So I'll just set my principal BSDF to 100% metallic. I'm just going to increase my shader editor up here. Maybe I can use the mask to introduce some roughness. So I'm going to select this color ramp here. I'll hit Control Shift D and that will duplicate the node whilst maintaining the connection to the previous node. I'll pop that down there. I'll zoom into that node. For this blue, I'm going to set to black. For this blue, I'm going to set to black. So that's 0 roughness. And for this yellow flag, I'm going to set this to white. So I'll turn the saturation all the way down. I'll then take the colour from this colour ramp and plug it into the roughness. I'm going to invert this mask because I want the yellow to be shiny and I want the blue to be rough. So I'll hit Shift A and I'm going to go to colour and we'll choose invert colour and I'll pop that in between there. I'm going to increase my 3D viewport. I'll hit Shift A, I'm going to go mesh and I'm going to choose cube. And with the cube selected, I'm going to hold down Shift and left click select the Wobble Noise Looper geometry node object. I'll then hit Control L and we'll select Copy Modifiers. Okay, I'm going to select that new object. I'm going to hit numpad 1 to go into front view. We'll delete the edge split modifier. I'm going to delete the subdivision surface. We'll delete the solidify and we'll delete the other subdivision surface. So the only thing left is the geometry node's Wobble Noise Looper. So I'm going to go Add Modifier, we'll go Generate, and I'm going to choose Wireframe. I'll increase the thickness to 1. I'm going to change the offset to 1. We'll enable Boundary. I'll then click Add Modifier, we'll go to Generate and we'll choose Subdivision Surface. I'll increase the levels for the viewport to 4, and for the render I'm going to increase them to, let's say, 6. I'll then right click and we'll choose Shade Smooth. I think I'll increase the thickness for the wireframe modifier on this cube, so I'm going to set the thickness to 2. I also want a different material on this object, but the problem is in our geometry nodes we chose set material and we could only choose one material, so I'm going to expose the material value in the modifiers. So I'm just going to increase this window here. I'll select the inner object, I'll change it from my shader editor to geometry node editor. I'll then select the geometry node modifier, just so it appears in the geometry node editor. I'll just select this group input here, hit Shift D to duplicate, and I'll pop that down here. I hit Control H to expand all the sockets, and then from this set material node I'm going to drag the material socket into the bottom socket of the group input node, and with this group input selected I'm going to hit Control H just to hide all the unused sockets. And now if I go to my modifier stack, you can see that we can change the material on the fly. So I'm going to select this object here, I'm going to change this to the shader editor window, we'll click Add New Material and we'll call this Material 2. And with this object selected, I can then go to my geometry nodes modifier over here and we'll select that Material 2. I'm going to change the colour to kind of like a light pink, something around there. And then I'll go to subsurface scattering, expand those options, and I'll increase the weight to, let's say, 0.25. I'll increase the scale to 2 meters. I'm going to go to my outliner, I'm going to select the default light, I'll just increase the 3D viewport window. Where's my light? There it is. Okay, so I'll select the lamp. I'm going to go to my object data over here and I'm going to set the X, Y and Z location to 0, and for the X, Y and Z rotation I'll also set to 0. I'm going to hit numpad 1 to go into front view, numpad period to zoom into that object. I'm going to go into rendered view. I'm going to change it from Eevee to cycles. I'll then hit Control Alt numpad 0 and that will align my camera to the 3D viewport. I'll select my camera in my outliner. I'm going to go to my camera settings down here. I'm going to have my focal length set to, let's say, 24mm. I then go to my object data down here. I'm going to set the Z location to 0. I've also got my X location set to 0. I'll also decrease the Y location until I've got everything in frame, maybe something around there. In fact, I'm going to go back to my camera data down here. I'm going to set it to, let's say, 40mm. I then go back to my object data over here and I'll decrease the Y location until I've got everything in frame, maybe something around there. I'll then select the lamp. I'm going to go to my light data tab down here and I'm going to decrease the strength to, let's say, 250 watts. I'm still not happy with the outer material, so I'm just going to select the outer cube object, which was this object here. Hit numpad 0 to go to camera view. I'll increase my shader editor slightly. I'm going to increase the roughness to 100% rough. I'm going to go to my world tab over here, decrease the strength to 0. I'm going to go to my render settings over here. I'm going to take my noise threshold down to 0.025, and for max samples I'm going to set this to 512. Instead of having blue and gold, I might replace the gold with pink with a subsurface scattering just to keep the theme coherent. So I'm going to select this inner object here, I'll increase this window, I'm going to change this yellow to pink, I'm going to change it from metallic to diffuse. I'll expand the subsurface scattering options here, and for this colour ramp, white will be 1, which is 1 on here, which is on. So I'm going to plug this colour ramp direct into the weight of the subsurface scattering. I'll also increase the scale to 1. I'll just decrease this window. I'm going to go over to my render settings over here, and under light paths I think I'm going to decrease the diffuse and glossy bounces to 3. I'll disable reflective and refractive caustics, and maybe I can just reduce the max samples to 128 just for a test render. I'm not really happy with the black background, so I'm going to add a plane in the background. So I'll just leave camera view. I'm going to hit Shift A, I'm going to go mesh and I'll choose plane. I'll then hit RX90, hit enter. I'm going to hit numpad 3 to go into side view. I'll then navigate into wireframe view. I'll hit G, Y, hold down control, snap it to the grid, so around about there. I'll go back into viewport shading. I hit numpad 1 to go into front view. I'm going to hit S4, enter, control A, and we'll apply the scale. Numpad 0 to go into camera view. I'll just go into rendered view, and for this background plane, I'm going to select that second material, material 2. Maybe I'll go to my outliner, I'll select the light. I'm going to go to my light data tab down here. I'm going to increase the radius to 0.25, just for softer shadows. I'll then select the inner object, and I think I want the blue to be shiny and the subsurface pink to be rough. So all I have to do here, because I added the invert color node. I'll just take the factor of the invert color to 0, and that should flip the mask. Excellent. I'll just go into viewport shading. I'm going to hit Control S to save the project. I'll hit F12 to render out a test frame. Okay, I'm happy with that. So I'll just close this window. I'll navigate to my output tab over here. I'll then choose an output file location where I want to save my image sequence. I'll click accept. If you're happy with the final result, you can select the file format of PNG, which is lossless. I'm going to change my file format to OpenEXR with a codec of DWAA lossy, and that will decrease my file size whilst increasing my dynamic range for post-production. This is ready to render, but before we do that, I'll just go over to my modifiers over here, and now we can mark this wobble noise loop geometry nodes modifier as an asset, which you can then use in other projects. To do that, I'm going to go to my outliner. I'll click this button here. I'm going to change it from view layer to blender file. We'll scroll down until we see node groups, expand those options, click your wobble noise looper GN, right click, and then choose mark as asset. You'll then have to go to edit, preferences, and under file paths. For the asset to show up in your asset library, you'll have to click this plus button and then add the file location where you saved your blender file, and then click this icon here and click save preferences. Close that. So now if I change this window to my asset browser, locate the current file in this menu here, and then you should see your wobble noise loop modifier. I'm going to go from current file to all libraries, and I'll search for wobble, and then I'll see it here. And I've already created a My GeoNodes tools. You can do that by clicking this button here and then naming it. So I'm going to drag this modifier into my GeoNodes tools, and then if I click My GeoNodes tools, it should be in there. Excellent. We'll just change this from the asset browser to the shader editor again. I'll go to my render tab. I'll hit Control S to save the project. I'll then hit Control F12, and that will render out the image sequence. If you join me on Patreon as a free member, you'll have access to this file alongside other Blender files from previous tutorials. That's this tutorial in a nutshell. I hope you found this useful. If you did, please click like and subscribe. It really helps my channel. Have a great day, level up, and thanks for watching.